I'm Chris Anderson. Welcome to my channel, Xenogenesis, where I apply the dark arts of evolutionary psychology to Black community interests. Now, this video is a response to the small number of you who, throughout the Black Masculinity series, were asking for solutions, questions about, well, how do we deal with some of these challenges that I've been talking about that have to do with race, racism, how groups compete. So this was about 2-3 years ago. I think it was in 2023. I made this video. So it will be in two parts. So you'll get the first part now, and the second part will probably be a day or two later after that. And if you are amongst that small number, I don't expect too many people to watch this, but for those of you who did seem genuinely interested in understanding the technical aspects of how a group comes together, stays together, works together in a highly cooperative manner, and then grows, becomes something really big to turn things around and have the Black community have the well-being and the outcomes that we're looking for. After you've watched those two parts, if you have more questions, go ahead and put them in the comments section. But to be honest, I won't be able to get too technical in the comments section. So hopefully these two parts, it's 4 parts, but I'll put the 2 parts together, so it will just be a first half and a second half. So altogether it will be maybe a little bit over an hour. But yeah, this should answer, pretty much all of those questions. But yeah, if you do have some more questions, then fine. Maybe I can direct you to some sources and reading material for you to get a better, more technical idea of how to form these groups and make them very successful. So you've heard me many times talk about intergroup competition, or now that we know what the game is, this is the game that we're all playing and the game we have to play, the game is the game. So this kind of outlines technically how we bring those groups together. It's got some examples historically of how groups have used what is called pro-sociality to achieve their group goals, improve their well-being and successful outcomes, and be very competitive in a very positive way with other groups. Let's say they're all subgroups in the same nation and they want to have, these really good outcomes in that nation. This kind of shows you technically, well, how do you do that? And then we'll look at some historical examples and contemporary examples of groups that are actually doing this today. So it's all about intergroup competitions, and competitions have winners and losers. So, but you can learn technically the evolutionary behavior science does have a lot to say about intergroup competitions and how to win them. So Black Prosociality, the way forward to deal with our problems, it is going to be a high level of Black cooperation towards achieving these collective goals, which of course is eliminating all these things that are causing our community all these problems. But then that begs, the question, how do you get a high level of cooperation? This really is the problem. But pro-sociality is the proven way to go about conquering a lot of these problems that we've talked about. But what is pro-sociality? So we really need to define that, and then we'll show some examples of it historically and in contemporary times. So pro-sociality is really, how do you support your own group, getting along with, supporting, cooperating. When you have this way of everyone working for the team, it allows the tribe to thrive in diverse ways and really helps them attack the problems that they have or become more successful. And they do this through building of social institutions. And these institutions also lead to success in competition with other groups. Because remember, we're all subgroups in the same place, in the same nation, domain, so on. And we're all going after the resources that exist in that domain. Now, if some groups are operating at a higher level in terms of their pro-sociality towards each other, then they do better. They're competing at a much higher level, so they do a better job getting a hold of those resources because they have more harmony, more cooperation, which helps them achieve these goals at a better rate than the other groups they're competing against. So the question then becomes, how do we design these pro-social institutions? And you can design them. A lot of them can happen naturally through your culture, but there can be all kinds of things that interfere with that process. So sometimes you need to consciously step in and design these institutions. So pro-sociality is not just within the group, it's also between groups, because you have to be able to cooperate with the other groups if you're dealing with a very large population, because you can't just do it across a very large population. It's going to be groups of groups networked that are all competing for this goal. So one of the core elements of how you're going to create pro-sociality for your group, you have to have shared identity and a shared purpose. It's critical for a high level of performance. If you don't have these two, then your collective group effort isn't going to go anywhere, because this is what bonds you together. And you also have to be able to have a balance or satisfy individual and group interests at the same time. If you don't have this balance, we always tend to know what the group goals are, the group objective, but how do you keep all the individuals buying in? You know, we all have selfish interests as well as individuals. And if we think we're not getting something out of participating in the group, then this tends to hurt the long-term success of the group, whether it's selfish interests undermining the group, or people no longer wishing to participate, not feeling recognized, not feeling valued, things like that. So you want to have this balance between individual and group interests. And when you do this, then you get, effective coordination within the group, and then with the other groups that are going to be networked together. So if you build something, let's say in your local area that's successful, other models develop because your successful model then moves on to other areas and you all network together, but this can scale up as high as you want to go. So I did introduce this, I think, a couple lectures back, that these are the three main problems that we have. All the other problems tend to go under this umbrella of what I'm calling the three-body problem. So we all know number three, so I don't really need to say much about that. I know I've been speaking regularly about prestige bias psychology. So if you've come for the prior lectures, you have some idea of what that is. When we pay attention to the high status, the prestige of certain types of individuals or groups or cultures or societies, it then tends to influence us. And for us, it's been working to add layers of bad culture on top of number one, which is historical and has existed for a long time. So we've got a lot of bad culture that we already have, some historical racism, but the prestige bias psychology that all humans have within our population, it's adding new layers of maladaptive culture on top of the bad culture that was already there. So this then causes performance problems, which leaves us too weakened to actually deal with number three the way we want to. Now, the way you solve the three-body problem is you start with number two. You take a hold of this psychology and you use it positively, as opposed to the negative way it's being used against us, to create intentional cultural change that is adaptive and positive and good. And you can also use that to now start breaking down number one, the anti-Blackness culture. So when you've got a hold of number two, you're breaking down number one, you're now in a much more powerful position because you've raised the level of performance of your group to be able to deal with number three and reduce some of the damaging effects of number three. So our first historical example is Black Wall Street. You had areas in America where Black Americans got together in several different places. Some people think it's just one, but it wasn't. There was Virginia, North Carolina, and Oklahoma, and so on. I think the most famous one was Greenwood in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So this is a very good example of Black pro-sociality in the midst of overt white supremacy in the form of Jim Crow apartheid. So how did it work? Why did it work? But most importantly, why is it gone? Why did it decline if it was actually so successful for so long a period of time? So this is from the book Black Wall Street, From Riot to Renaissance in Tulsa's historic Greenwood district. The author, Hannibal Johnson, he showed evidence that Black entrepreneurs had this idea, vision, to create something for Black people, by Black people, because they believed that Blacks had a better chance of economic success if they pooled their resources. And again, this is to deal with the damaging effects of Jim Crow apartheid. Now, if you recall, one of the design features I spoke about, shared identity, shared intent, shared purpose, you see it right there in the quotes. Black people and having a better chance at economic success. So there's your tribal identity and there's your shared purpose right there. And they started working together to make that happen. They bought land, they started loaning money to other Black people to open their businesses. They spent their money with each other. They did all these pro-social behavioral patterns that then lifted them into these, created basically a Black middle class. And this is in the middle of Jim Crow apartheid. So it led to all these things we see here, this high level of group cooperation, greater economic production, and then it attracted other people because it's now a successful model. Blacks are thriving in this area. Other Blacks hear about it, move there, and also start being pro-social towards each other. So this, of course, helped with family development, educational attainment, and everything that goes along with improving your standard of living. Again, right in the middle of open white supremacy, just through a high level of pro-social behavior towards each other, they were able to achieve this without appealing to any formal white institutions. They're not asking white people to stop their racism or anything. They just took care of it themselves. However, it wasn't sustained because it was actually not a cultural framework. There wasn't really the right type of design feature for the pro-social behavior to continue. This was actually a response to a threat to the tribe, an existential threat in the form of Jim Crow. And they started to break down Jim Crow apartheid. So now the ecological threat is being removed. So the pro-social behavior pattern then went into decline because, of course, a lot of Black people wanted acceptance. They wanted to assimilate. They wanted to move into these other white areas. And they felt, okay, now I can vote. I'm going to be able to do all these things I wasn't doing before, we couldn't do before. We're going to be able to get, what all the white people get. So they thought this type of behavior pattern wasn't needed anymore. The threat was being removed. Of course, they were wrong, but, they didn't know that. And they were really, looking forward to being accepted and treated like full human beings and not second-class citizens. But this caused, the pro-social behavior to decline and the selfish behavior to increase, unraveling the effectiveness of the group. So now what they had achieved for the first 50 years, all of that was gone. So this is a very good example of what Black pro-sociality can do. It reduced the effects of racial inequality without any effort to reduce racist behavior in white people. And this is our number 1 and 2 of the 3-body problem, can reduce the effects of number 3, because they were able to build this Black middle class and all the positive outcomes they got as a result of that, just through their own agency as a group with this high level of positive pro-social behavior towards each other. So if your tribe is perceived by everyone, including your own tribe, as being at the bottom of the people status hierarchy, as a lower ranked people, just because you're Black, then you're generally going to receive the treatment that goes along with that status and ranking. And here's a anecdotal real world example of that. This is an actress, Amanda Stenberg. In 2012, she was in the first Hunger Games movie playing the character of Rue. And when social media found out that she was actually playing the character of Rue, these were some of the comments from huge fans of the book series. So awkward moment when Rue is some Black girl, not the little blonde innocent girl you picture. Call me racist, but when I found out Rue was Black, her death wasn't as sad. I was pumped about the Hunger Games until I learned a Black girl was playing Rue. And this one, how in the world are they gonna make Rue a freaking Black bitch? So these were people who had read the book, and they didn't realize that the character was Black. Now, there was so much of this going on, it became a national story. And the author of the book series actually had to come out and make a statement and say the character was always Black. She described her as having dark brown skin, but they just weren't paying attention enough to understand that she was describing a Black character. But they had already emotionally invested in the character when they thought she wasn't Black. But when they saw that she was now Black, look at some of the responses we see here. Now, this is a product of what you would call a cultural niche construct. So there are preferences with regard to what you see here. Skin color, hair type, facial features, body shape, all of those things, standards and values around those types of beliefs can be embedded in culture, internalized, and then reproduced. So this is the cultural construct we already exist within. And all these preferences tend to work against us. So this is how, when we assimilate into this society fully, you end up kind of at the back of the line, because this causes disadvantages because of the negative qualities they attach to our skin color, our African phenotype. So it causes the problems we see with regard to prejudgment and discrimination. So it's not possible to fully assimilate into Western culture when these values exist in that culture at the same time. You can't expect to meet with long-term group success when the values and the beliefs and attitudes around race disadvantage you when you are a Black person. So even if you can point to the individual success stories and talk about, well, we're doing better than 20 years ago or something like that, this is relative. When we are constantly talking about racial inequalities, there are several different factors that play a role, but this right here, this is definitely one of those strong factors. So when you fully assimilate into that, as we talked about in earlier lectures, this affects our performance because we are internalizing these negative qualities that are attached to our appearance with regard to the values in this culture. And as I showed with all the research in prior lectures, this hurts our performance as a group. Okay, so part two, the need for pro-social institutions. So I think we've all, heard this message about, buy from Black-owned businesses, how this can help deal with a lot of our problems. It wouldn't surprise me if you've heard of some or even all three of these books. Powernomics seems to be the one that's most well known, published a few decades ago by Dr. Claude Anderson. So really, it's about what we're talking about here, how we can use economic pro-sociality to empower ourselves. And it's mainly by buying from Black-owned businesses, just pooling our economic resources. Now, the Black Tax came out maybe 2018. And this guy, Sean Rochester, he actually read my book and contacted me and started talking to me about how, to get this message out, because from reading my book now, he understood why, even though we've understood this, for the longest time, for 100 years, why haven't we actually been following it when so many scholars have basically laid out from A to Z how we should do this economic support of our own communities. So even though it would be excellent to do it and everyone's put the plans of how to do it there, we're not doing it. So this is why we need to do it. Obviously, the discrimination we face in employment, economic pro-sociality would knock this out. We wouldn't have to worry about how we're less likely to be hired, even though everything is equal on the CV, except once they see that Black name, 50% less likely to receive the callback or job offer. When there's an economic downturn, or, we saw what happened with COVID here. So this is a slide I think I showed either in the last lecture or the one before, but you'll see the COVID unemployment rate for young people, so 16 to 24-year-olds, for white people, 13%. But look at where Black people are, 35%. So we're hit 3 times as hard. So if we're practicing a high level of economic Black pro-sociality, this is our plan to deal with how we get hit 3 times harder when the economic hard times hit and create, joblessness for our young people, And you see, it doesn't even hit Asians as hard as it hits us, because the Asians are down there at 24%, we're at 35%. And it's always like this. So this is in the UK here. And then when you look at the numbers in the United States, it's similar. So if we don't have a plan for that, we're just always at the mercy of whenever these hard times hit, knowing we're going to get hit 3 times as hard. And all we can do is talk to politicians and ask for this and ask for that. But you never get it because this pattern is quite consistent. And if this is how they feel about you, again, this is going to play a role in the valued areas in society where you want to be treated equally. But if this is what's in their mind about you, then again, there's going to be that inequality. These thoughts about Black people will play a role in the institutional inequalities that we face. So economic Black pro-sociality, it needs pro-social support to be successful. We all know the message, but in that book, The Black Tax by Sean Rochester, he showed that African Americans have $1.4 trillion spending power, and that they spend 98% of that money with white-owned businesses. So this is how they're working against their own interests. If they take that money and, when possible, spend it in their own communities with their own businesses, 1.4 trillion will go a very, very long way. But that type of behavior change needs institutional support, and they don't have it. A book can't do it. You need a structural support system to be able to do that. And that will be the same issue right here, because we do Black Pound Day here, but we're going to need institutional support for it to really take off the way it needs to. This needs to be a way of life. It can't be something we did because of George Floyd, or even once a month, or something when we advertise over Instagram and social media. This needs to be a way of life. It's not a solution if you can't get the solution into the minds and change behavior of a large percentage of your population. So 3, 4, 5, 6%, that's not going to do anything. You have to have a way of getting it into a large chunk. And now we're going to look at another example of another ethnic group where this is a way of life. So the Chaldean are an ethnic group that migrated out of northern Iraq, and a lot of them now live in Detroit. They've been migrating there for 100 years. And they practice a very high level of pro-sociality towards themselves. So if you don't know the story of Detroit, this was like the home of United States automaking industry, but the bottom fell out of it, during the last quarter of the 20th century. This is why you see those abandoned buildings and, symbols of poverty and so forth. So economically, they've really been suffering over the past several decades, but the Chaldean have not been suffering because they practice a high level of pro-sociality towards their identity and their people. So they attach great importance and value to their homeland, their culture, identity, traditions, all of that. They stress family over the individual and offer classes in their native language, which is Aramaic. So they don't just allow the dominant culture to train their children. They provide structural support that their cultural traditions are maintained in the succeeding generations to preserve identity. They encourage their children to marry within the community as they did in Iraq. And of course, some people are always going to marry out, but they have a very high rate of intermarriage amongst their ethnic group. They dominate the small grocery shop business, and a lot of these businesses are in Black communities. So they're making a lot of money off the African-American community. They run them as like extended family businesses, and then other businesses have developed that service the grocery shop domination they have. So when they need supplies, when they need servicing, when they need remodeling, anything that the grocery shop network needs, there are other Chaldean businesses now that now service those businesses. And of course, when they want something to eat, they go to their own stores. They only hire their own people for the most part, including their youth. So when their youth hit 15, 16, 17, they just walk into a job. They do not reinvest into the Black community. This has caused some conflict over there. But look, I don't blame them. The Black communities should be going to their own Black-owned businesses and investing in themselves and not begging another ethnic group to invest in themselves. The Chaldeans are taking care of themselves. We should be taking care of ourselves. When new immigrants from the Chaldean community in northern Iraq, as they walk off the plane, there are jobs waiting for them. Their business network is waiting right there. Give them a job stocking shelves or working in a petrol station or in a chemist or something like that. Right away, they got work waiting for the immigrants that are part of their ethnic group that show up. And so they've branched out into all these other businesses, petrol stations, collision shops, all of this stuff. They all go and serve these businesses with their patronage. And then the second and third generations are now moving into the higher level type careers. So law, education, doctors, dentistry. And when they need any of those, they find a Chaldean accountant, a Chaldean lawyer, so on and so forth. So they preferentially use all of these services from their own people. And this is right now. This isn't 50 years ago. They were doing it 50 years, but they've continued to do it. So right now in 2021, this is how they operate. And they meet with criteria number one, shared identity, shared purpose. And they don't leave it up to just families to pass this on. They have community structural support to maintain this high level of pro-sociality. And this is in the midst of being in the dominant culture, which is white American. They are not segregated. They live around Black people and white people. What connects them is their culture and the behavior pattern they display and broadcast towards each other. So their support for their identity and the outcomes they want for their ethnic group, it's strategic, it's planned, it's conscious and direct. They don't just leave it up to chance or hope. They've built a framework to maintain this high level of pro-sociality towards each other. So this erases inequality. When everyone else was suffering with all the bad economy in Detroit, the Chaldeans were chilling. Everything was good. They had no problems because they were just supporting each other. This led to success, obviously, in competition with the other local groups. So when the Chaldean were doing fine, African Americans would be suffering, even the Muslim population, because they have a high Muslim population, and they weren't doing too well either. But the Chaldeans were doing good because the level of pro-sociality they expressed towards each other allowed them to outcompete those other groups for the resources in their area, because they maintained control of the resources they had by sharing it with each other. So they have autonomous control over the well-being of their tribe without having to beg any state institution for anything. So they have a high level of group cohesion. So this starts with these two right here, social cohesion and task cohesion. The quality of the relationships within the group is managed, and then the level of commitment to the shared purpose is ingrained, and you put those two together and you've got a high-performing cooperative tribe. So some smaller examples of our pro-sociality. This is right here in England, when the Windrush generation came here and they started experiencing all the racism in education that Black children were dealing with. So they started the supplementary schools and Saturday schools to deal with the problem of racism that we were facing in the school system. Now, some of these schools are still around, but it's not to the extent that it used to be years ago, which I would say is a failure on our part. So this is the evidence of what our children are facing in the school system. We looked at this in prior lectures, so we know that Black Caribbean and Black African pupils are being under-assessed compared to white pupils and Indian and Chinese mixed who are over-assessed. And we know this because when they actually take the national exams, the Black children always outperform their assessment, whereas the white pupils and Indian pupils actually underperform based on how they were assessed. So we've seen that they're marking our children down, they're put in low ability groups when they don't belong there, like 2 or 3 times at the rate that they do for other children. So this would again support why we needed the supplementary schools and the Saturday schools, along with obviously the bad racial image that we need to attack. And the supplementary schools, the Saturday schools, give you the ability to do that. And I know because I used to teach a Saturday school class. So this kind of education and support for our children, again, this is an example of how you had structural support for the values and behavioral patterns that we wanted, to infuse, into our youth. So this network going into decline, it's not to our advantage. It should be actually completely opposite. We should be pushing this, because in this network, we can teach what we want. There's no, government agency sticking their nose in telling us what we can and can't teach. Certainly not when I was teaching it. These are two examples of people who attended Saturday school. So Andre Skeppel, he's an IT businessman who's created information technology to assist the education of children with neurodivergent mental states. And Akala, I think you all know him, the rapper and public speaker. He's written books and things, Black issues and so forth. But this is what Andre said about his experience from the supplementary school system. So take a moment to read that. Now, he's making some really important points here, because when the class I taught was, I was telling Nigel earlier, it's like a defense against white supremacy class. So with my psychology background, I could teach the children what stereotypes this society is trying to force into them about themselves. I could teach them to identify it and to shield their psychology from internalizing these negative stereotypes, and teach them to be able to identify it. You have to be able to teach them to be able to protect themselves from that. Because as you know from the earlier lectures, this is getting into our children's heads very early because it's embedded in culture. So 2, 3, 4, and 5, it's already there. So if they're not having this attacked in the school system, then we have to have our own supplementary school system where we teach them how to identify what's being done to them. So I've underlined where Andre said, I understood how the game is played. He understood how he was being portrayed as a young Black person, the negative stereotypes that were working against him and what they wanted him to believe about himself that was negative and weakening. But in the supplementary school systems, they had the antidote for that. They taught true knowledge of self and let them know what, that you're a player in this game and how to play the game and win, and not be mentally weakened by what they want you to think of yourself as an African person. We can't wait for adulthood. That gives basically the enemy 2 decades of a head start in forcing maladaptive, evil racial perceptions into our young people. And we can't have that. Now, this is from a Ghanaian study in America, where they were studying Ghanaian achievements in the United States. And the Ghanaian community does very well in the United States, but they wanted to maintain being able to do well. And they looked at how East Asians were being successful from the research of East Asian researchers on why Koreans and Chinese students were doing well in America. And it's right there. They have structural support for their cultural values and to maintain the behavior pattern that will lead to their success. And they do it through a Saturday school system as well. They have a lot of structural support, actually. When it comes to test taking and all these things, they have a great network of preparing their children to do very well educationally, but at the same time, maintaining their cultural standards that also assist them with understanding their identity and what their ability level is. They have the structural support to do that. And so this study here on Ghanaian immigrant children was saying they need to replicate the same pattern through their churches, their community organizations, and so forth, if they want to maintain Ghanaian achievements in the United States, to continue that success. They understand they need structural support for that to happen, because if not, they'll assimilate, you pick up the ideas of the dominant culture, and that's when the maladaptive culture gets in and starts to weaken your ability to perform at a high level. And we'll revisit that at the end of the lecture as well, because that's really important. So question time.
Yes, sir. Thank you for part two. I have my own questions as always, but I'm going to give the opportunity to our guests first and foremost. Let me just see if anyone wants to chime in. Please raise your virtual hand. And we're going to start with Jamaica. Can we have your question, please?
Sure. Hey, hi. I wanted to ask a question simply because you did bring up Detroit, and that's where I was born and raised, and I still live right outside Detroit. So everything you said is true. I grew up. I had an uncle who had a business. He had a gas station, and he told us that we you question why are all these businesses non-black in a majority black city, and the thing that always been told to us was that it's because when the changes for immigration laws came about after the civil rights movement, people were given like tax breaks and opportunities to open up their own businesses, and of course they went into black neighborhoods. And my uncle said like he had a gas station, and the let's say an Arab, we used to call them, we just always say Arab, so I'm glad you did specifically say Chaldean because that's a specific group of Middle Easterners, and they would get a tax break 5 years, they said, and they would lower their rates for like, let's say $1, and people will start going, they'll steal business from a black person. And then once that black person go out of business, then of course they'll raise their prices up. And I just wonder if you got any information like that. And then another thing you said, that confirmation, again, growing up in Detroit, Nation of Islam started in Detroit, we used to get, they used to be all over on the corner selling their, fruits and their newspapers. And people would say, the reason why these, immigrants are so successful because they have their Saturday programs, like Saturday food. So that's another thing that I just grew up around all of that. And it's interesting that, you said in your presentation too.
Yeah. Thank you for saying that. There are several, examples of groups behaving like that. And, even in the beginning where I showed Black Americans were doing that, they were highly successful throughout the first part of the 20th century. They just needed to stick to it. All this, effort to go live amongst white people, get what white, they didn't need to do all of that. They just need to stay working with each other, and they would have been doing really, really well. But this is part of the mindset in that we're constantly asking to get next to them, to get what they have. We can get it by working with each other. We really don't have to ask them for these things. Now, we do have it harder because like Jamaica just said, the Chaldean will be treated a little differently compared to how they're going to treat African Americans. Black people are always the number one target, the number one threat. So the way they're going to treat Asians or Middle Easterners and so on, we're not going to get that treatment, which it really emphasizes even more why we've just got to work with each other and become powerful amongst ourselves. And then we can start to deal with these external threats that we are always going to face. So thank you, Jamaica, for that. Okay, so I'm going to stop this one here. Look for the second half in a few days.